Welcome to today's episode of Bike Fit Tuesdays. In today's episode, 10 bike fit tips for new cyclists. You gotta get up. You've got filming to do.
Don't buy a race bike, buy an endurance bike. Race bike is designed for 60 kilo, 20-year-old athletes to win races like the Tour de France. You then translate that to an individual in his 50s who sits at a desk all day. It's a bit like buying a Formula 1 car and driving it to Tesco's.
Not everybody is 50 and sits at a desk all day though.
No, that's true, but the vast majority of people, of consumers, are not 20 years old and at an athlete level. Race bikes tend to require high levels of fitness, good levels of strength, generally less upper body mass, typical of a professional cyclist, in order for them to be ridden comfortably. Endurance bikes inherently are a bit more comfort orientated, they have a longer wheelbase which makes them more stable, the geometry is generally far less aggressive and tends to work much better for consumers. These days as well, they're getting a lot lighter, they're getting a lot stiffer. So you can still ride them fast, it's just that they're generally better suited to consumers. Good example of an endurance bike would be something like the bike behind me, which is Cannondale Synapse. My personal favourite is the Look 765. There are cheaper versions of this as well, so Specialized does a bike called a Sector. Giant make a bike called a Contend, Trek make a bike called a Damani. Most major manufacturers will have an endurance orientated bike, usually at the lower end. They're usually also equipped with disc brakes as standard, which gives you slightly better braking performance. And they're taller head tube, shorter reach, and longer wheelbase. For our next trick, we're going to need our friend Chris. Handlebar width should be as wide as your shoulders. Most off-the-shelf road bikes come with handlebars that are too wide. So if you consider that most men, when I measure them, measure between 39 and 41 centimeters across the acromion process, the distal part of the scapula, this renders a 42 centimeter handlebar to be too wide for most people. What that results in is people tend to roll the wrists like this, which results in numb hands, neck and shoulder issues, that kind of stuff. But also it creates an inability to reach the brake levers. Now there's a reach around joke here. If your handlebars are wider than you are, you're reaching it around the handlebar to get at the brake lever. Accompanying that with excessive reach, which we'll come on to later, and you can't reach the brake levers when you're on the drops in the descent, which is pretty problematic actually. We're going to show you how to measure for your handlebars. We are, like I say, measuring across the acromion process. From here to here. Chris here is a pretty slender guy. He's 34, 35 centimeters. Most men will measure, as I said, 39 to 41. Women, there seems to be a wider spectrum with women. The smallest women I think I've measured about 32, 33 centimeters, all the way up to 38. Generally speaking, a 40 centimeter handlebar is the most common bar width I sell on a massive scale. I would say 90% of male clients tend to leave here with a 40 centimeter handlebar. Women, like I say, anywhere between 34, 36 and 38 centimeters. It's worth noting that not all handlebars are measured in the same way. So if you buy a Data handlebar, for example, Data Elementi is a very popular Italian brand, they measure outer to outer, which means a 40 centimeter Data bar is actually a 38. So, which actually means most people end up buying the right size by accident. So it's worth noting that when you're looking on manufacturers' websites, they will iterate how they're measuring these handlebars. So some will measure across the drops, some will measure across the top at the control location, some will measure outer to outer. It's also worth noting that some handlebars will flare, so the drop will be wider set than the tops will be. A very good example of this would be Envy's Aero handlebar, which is ridiculously narrow and at the hood and ridiculously wide at the drop. A tip for those of you with small little hands, on a lot of shifters these days you can adjust the reach of the brake lever. This might make it easy for you to reach the lever when you're on the drops. It's worth noting that changing the handlebar width is likely to influence this a lot more than just adjusting the reach of the brake lever. But for, like I say, particularly some women and gents with smaller hands, you might want to wind this lever in. Where you do that will depend on the lever. So this is a Claris lever. I use these on the jig because they're cheap. Most of the Shimano mechanical levers, there's 2.5mm Allen key at the back here, and as you wind it in, you can see that the brake lever gets closer to the handlebar. Yeah? If I wind it back out again, you can see how much scope there is. Some of the SRAM levers will have, I think it's a 2.5, might be a 2mm Allen key up inside here somewhere, and that's also where I think a lot of the electronic and hydraulic adjustment is on the Shimano levers as well. You can find all this information on tech documents, or simply just Google brake lever reach adjustment on SRAM force, whatever it is, whatever system it is that you've got. If you don't know what the system is, it'll usually be written on the lever somewhere. Still on handlebars, so much can be done at the front end here. So the next one, this is probably my favourite, is handlebar setup and control location. Now, the reason this is important is because you can massively influence the reach to the handlebars simply by playing around with the handlebar rotation and the control location.
Which is free.
Which is free. One of the first things that I would always do, and this is a very general rule and it will depend slightly on the handlebar, but one way of getting the handlebar set up correctly in terms of rotation like this is get a little spirit level, get that vertical. Yeah, so we're looking at this bubble here. What that means is that you will offset the reach of the handlebar. Worth noting that not all reaches are created equal. Something like a zip or a 3T will be longer than a data, which is why I prefer datas. And then once you've got the handlebar set up properly, you can then set your control location. Get the control set up with a little bit of angle on the grounds that as you present your hand to it, it sits in your hand. If you've got it pan flat, some people prefer this, but if you've got it completely flat or perpendicular with the ground, you end up having to roll the wrists a little bit like this. The opposite end of the spectrum, if you've got the bar rolled up like this, it means that you end up falling off the drop and you can't reach the brake levers when you're on the drops as well. Secondly, control location on the lever. The reason this is important is because you can change the reach. When I say reach, I'm talking about the distance from the back of the lever to the nut to the saddle, which is how the human being interacts with it. You can change that figure by up to 2 centimeters just by changing the control location and the handlebar rotation. So for example, we've got 2 shifters here set up in different ways. So if we measure this one is 60 centimeters, to prove my point, this control is set slightly lower on the handlebar, 61.5 centimeters. So just by changing the control location of the on the handlebar, you can really get quite a lot of reach off of the bike without necessarily having to pay for a new stem or pay for a different handlebar. The handlebar, it has to be said though, is probably the best way of changing reach or considering reach. And I know a lot of people will talk about stems, but some handlebars, as I said earlier, will have longer reaches, and if you cut that down, it means you end up not having to fit a really short stem to the thing. Don't make it too long. I don't know what it is about road cyclists, but they seem to have this liking for doing a plank and riding a bicycle at the same time. You don't want the thing really long. Firstly, it'll have ramifications in the saddle. It tends to result in a gravitation to the nose. That's where most saddle discomfort comes from, is a poor interaction, not necessarily just the reach per se. Another way of determining whether the reach is too long is if it feels too long. If it feels a little bit long, it's way too long. So on the grounds that as a human being you are very good at absorbing dysfunction, and with regards to reach, what you'll find is you'll absorb to the point that, oh, now it feels a bit long, right? So one way of potentially remedying this is, we talked about the handlebar, but you can also reduce the stem length. What I would also recommend you don't do is use the saddle setback as a means of reducing the reach. That should be a last ditch attempt to reduce the reach, because if you bring the saddle really far forward to reduce the reach, you end up upsetting the rider's weight distribution. You end up putting a lot of pressure on the hands. Generally speaking as well, most people can tolerate more handlebar drop than they can excessive reach. While we're on the subject of saddles, next tip. Saddle tilt. You want the saddle more or less level. Now, it's worth noting that this can be quite difficult because it depends on the saddle. So this saddle, which is a Pro Griffin, is pretty flat. I would normally set this with about 1 degree of negative tilt. This is measured across the 2 highest points of the saddle. In this instance, the saddle, like I say, is predominantly pretty flat. This is going to be the other way around now. Yeah. On saddles that have a bit more of a scoop in them, you're generally looking for the middle third to be more or less level. On a saddle like this, I might expect maybe a little bit more of a tilt, about -2 degrees, which is, I suspect is probably what that is, near enough. The reason this is important is that if you have too much tilt applied to the saddle, thank you British Cycling for this, you create a slope. And what happens when we put something on a slope? It rolls down the slope. Fuck's sake. What happens when you put something on a slope? So you end up with loads of pressure on the hands, you end up with putting loads of pressure to the nose of the saddle, and frankly, it's just not going to be much fun for you at all. Equally, you don't want to go the other way. Nose up results in usually posterior rotation of the pelvis. In English, rather than your pelvis being orientated like this, which is conducive to a neutral spine and good glute enlistment, you end up posteriorly rotating your pelvis like so to get your soft tissue in your genitals away from the saddle. So common is this compensation that a certain saddle brand developed a saddle selection and marketing system called Spine Concept. So ultimately, get your saddle more or less level. Andy's going to kill me because I've been working in here for a week and
it used to be so neat.
I haven't organised the saddles. Finish a fit, and I'm usually in so much of a flap, I kind of just do that. Buy a saddle with the pressure relief channel cut out of it. Pressure relief channel is something like this. Pressure relief channel is intended to relieve soft tissue, all right, and erogenous tissue. Now, the reason I think this is a good idea is because as human beings, we were not intended to sit on our genitals on hard pieces of foam. So what this does is it relieves that soft tissue and redistributes it to the skeleton. The lack of pressure relief typically results in riders sitting rotated, they sit off to one side, they sit pissed, they posteriorly rotate as we talked about in the previous tip. So generally speaking, I almost always encourage riders to use one of these. It's worth noting that if you have tried something like this, or specialised, of course I can't find a bit of the saddle that I want, a specialised toupee, for example, this is, and you don't find it comfortable, it's usually because you're not interacting with it correctly. Think about it like this. Most people, when they're on the saddle too high, for example, usually sit off to one side, which means that pressure relief channel, you ain't hitting it. You're sitting and you're sitting on this very, very hard ridge. So if you are getting discomfort on a saddle like this, and it's sort of gentle numbness, that kind of stuff, it's probably because of your interaction with the saddle rather than the saddle itself. Take your cleat as far back on the shoe as it'll go. The reason for this is it takes all the pressure away from the very delicate forefoot, so any numbness or tingling or pins and needles can be eliminated usually by taking the cleat further back. It tends to improve stability of the overall foot, and you end up generally improving kind of knee stability, pelvis, so on and so forth.
We're keeping the segments in this video quite short, but we have a longer video dedicated to cleat position, which I'll put in the description down below if you want to check it out.
As you move like down the stockroom, it's like, and when you're filming yourself, it looks like the Death Star trench run. Good day.
That's fine. I need help.
Don't use fixed cleats. In the 1980s and 1990s, there was an epidemic in professional racing in knee injuries, and it wasn't realised until some years later that it directly coincided with the introduction of the Look Black cleat, which was the first clipless pedal system, and it didn't allow the foot to move inside the pedal. And this is very popular in a lot of racing circles, unfortunately, and it's usually used as a means of masking instability of the foot, and the symptom of foot instability in cycling tends to be excessive float. All right, you can dial that out with good shoe fit, good arch support, cleat wedging, heel wedging, occasionally forefoot wedging. You don't almost, I would go as far as to say as you almost never need a fixed cleat, because it stops any form of tibial rotation, which occurs when you flex your knee. So I would always use in Shimano, either the yellow or the blue. There isn't an optimum float figure. I just think that you need some. So yellow or blue in Shimano, and red or grey in Look. And speed play, obviously you can dial it out. There are, as far as I'm aware, there isn't a fixed cleat for an SPD system. So generally, look after your knees, allow yourself a little bit of float. When advising my customers in a bike fit scenario, or even just generally day-to-day in the shop, I always recommend or make recommendations to them based on the things that are actually going to make a difference to your life. This is going to make more of a difference to your life than this. This is £3,500.
It's really nice though.
For one. I mean, it wants to be for £3,500 for one.
I like that. Thanks.
Yeah.
I'll look after it.
Okay. This, however, is going to make a bigger difference to your life. This is where all the power goes, or doesn't, as the case usually is. I have guys coming in here, they've got £10,000 bikes, they've got 50 quid shoes. You would go faster on a £2,000 bike with 300 quid worth of shoes than you would on a 10 grand bike with 50 quid worth of shoes. End of story.
And that concludes our 10 tips for beginners. If you have any more questions relating to bike fit or topics that you'd like us to cover in these videos, we're going to be doing some more. Put them in the comments down below. If you want to book a fit with James, because he does bike fitting, head to the website down in the description, although there's quite a long waiting list.
I think it's end of September for me now. But book in with Andy instead.